The 1970s gave television some untouchable classics. But let's be honest, it also gave networks a junk drawer of strange experiments, fading stars, tired spin-offs, and shows nobody wanted to admit they watched. Some were mocked, some were retooled into confusion, and some survived purely because executives were too stubborn to pull the plug. These are 1970s TV shows that looked like flops, but somehow kept crawling back. Number 19. Nanny and the Professor, 1970. At first glance, Nanny and the Professor looked like harmless family comfort food. A mysterious English nanny arrives at the home of a widowed professor, takes care of his children, and seems to possess a magical sense for trouble before it happens. It was soft, polite, cozy, and exactly the kind of show that felt like it belonged to the late 1960s, not the rapidly changing 1970s. And that was the problem. Television was getting sharper. All in the Family was about to change the sitcom forever. Audiences were starting to crave arguments, social tension, messy families, and comedy with bite. Nanny and the Professor still felt like it was serving tea in a room where everyone else had started yelling. The show survived for 3 seasons, but its magic was already fading. ABC moved it into a rougher time slot, and suddenly, that gentle little fantasy was facing much bigger competition. Ratings dropped, momentum disappeared, and what had once seemed charming started to feel out of step. It was not a disaster in the loudest sense, it was worse. It became invisible. Somehow, it lasted long enough to be remembered by a generation of kids. But even fans had to admit one thing: this was a show that survived longer on sweetness than actual heat. Number 18. That's My Mama, 1974. That's My Mama should have had more impact than it did. It had energy, a strong cast, a middle-class black family setting, and a lead character working in a Washington, D.C. barbershop, a location practically built for fast dialogue, gossip, and generational comedy. But despite all that promise, the show never truly broke through. The series followed Clifton Curtis, a young barber trying to enjoy bachelor life, while his opinionated mother, Eloise, kept pushing him toward marriage and responsibility. On paper, that was a clean sitcom engine. Every week, Clifton wanted freedom, Mama wanted stability, and the barbershop gave everyone a place to argue about it. But timing was brutal. The 1970s already had stronger, louder, more successful black sitcoms dominating the conversation. Good Times had more social fire. Sanford and Son had sharper comic chaos. The Jeffersons had class tension and attitude. Compared to those shows, That's My Mama felt lighter, smaller, and easier for audiences to skip. It ran for 2 seasons, which is surprising when you remember it was never a major ratings force. ABC kept it alive longer than its numbers probably justified, perhaps hoping the cast chemistry would finally catch. It never did. The show became one of those strange 1970s sitcoms that was not awful enough to become legendary, but not strong enough to become essential. Number 17. Temperatures Rising, 1972. Few 1970s sitcoms looked more desperate to survive than Temperatures Rising. This was not just a show that got retooled. This was a show that walked into surgery, came out with a different face, then went back in for another operation. The original version was a hospital sitcom starring James Whitmore as the strict chief of surgery and Cleveland Little as a mischievous doctor. The setup was simple: professional medical setting, comic trouble, authority figure trying to keep order. But the ratings were not strong enough, and ABC started panicking. Instead of canceling it, the network tried to rebuild it. Cast members changed. The tone changed. Paul Lynde was brought in. The title became The New Temperatures Rising Show. Then the format changed again. By the time viewers returned, it almost felt like 3 separate sitcoms fighting over the same hospital corridor. That is what makes it such a perfect 1970s flop survivor. A normal failure disappears quickly. Temperatures Rising kept being revived, rebranded, and reshuffled, as if the network refused to admit the patient was gone. The strange part is that it still managed to run for 2 seasons and 46 episodes. But all that tinkering created the opposite of confidence. Instead of looking fresh, the show looked nervous. Instead of growing an audience, it confused the audience it had. In the end, Temperatures Rising became less famous for its jokes than for its constant identity crisis. Number 16. Doc, 1975. Doc was not a terrible idea. In fact, it had the kind of setup television usually loves: a respected older doctor, a familiar workplace, and a cast full of eccentric people orbiting around him. Barnard Hughes played Dr. Joe Bogert, a family doctor with warmth, patience, and an old-fashioned sense of decency. The problem was that the show never became the comforting hit CBS wanted. It arrived in 1975, when sitcoms were already evolving fast. The audience had started expecting bolder personalities and sharper writing. Doc felt gentler, older, almost like it belonged to a previous decade. During its first season, the show performed well enough to earn another chance. But the second season exposed the weakness. The network and producers changed the supporting cast, tried to freshen the format, and hoped new energy would solve the problem. Instead, the changes made the series feel less stable. Viewers who liked the original version had less reason to stay, and new viewers did not rush in. Doc lasted 2 seasons, which sounds respectable until you realize how quickly it collapsed once the network stopped believing in it. It was not a spectacular crash. It was more like a patient slowly losing a pulse while everyone in the room pretended treatment was working. The show's biggest legacy is probably that it became another example of a 1970s sitcom kept alive by network hope, not audience obsession. Number 15. The Tony Randall Show, 1976. After The Odd Couple, Tony Randall had goodwill, talent, and name recognition. That should have made The Tony Randall Show a safe bet. Instead, it became one of those oddly respectable disappointments that kept getting second chances without ever becoming a real hit. Randall played Walter Franklin, a widowed judge trying to balance courtroom authority with home life. The show was smartly produced, professionally performed, and backed by MTM Enterprises, the company behind some of the decade's most admired sitcoms. So why did it struggle? Because being tasteful is not the same as being addictive. The show had polish, but it lacked the explosive comic chemistry Randall had with Jack Klugman on The Odd Couple. Without that friction, the series felt pleasant rather than urgent. Viewers could admire it without feeling the need to watch every week. ABC aired it for 1 season, then let it go. CBS picked it up for a second season, which is where the somehow ran for years part becomes fascinating. A show that could not fully click on one network was handed another life on another network, mostly because everyone involved knew Randall was too talented to waste. But talent alone could not save it. The Tony Randall Show ended after 2 seasons, remembered as a classy flop. Not embarrassing, not hated, just strangely unable to become the success everyone seemed to expect. Number 14. Carter Country, 1977. Carter Country was one of those shows that clearly tried to bottle a political moment. It premiered during the Jimmy Carter era, leaned into small-town Southern comedy, and placed a black police officer from New York inside a mostly white Southern police department. That setup had room for culture clash, race commentary, and sharp satire. Instead, the show often settled for broad stereotypes and easy jokes. Some critics saw it as tired. Others thought it leaned too heavily on redneck humor. The title itself made it feel like ABC was trying to surf the national fascination with the South after Carter's election, even if the actual comedy was not strong enough to last. The series followed Chief Roy Moby and Sergeant Curtis Baker as they tried to maintain order in the fictional town of Clinton Corners, Georgia. There were moments when the cast made the material work, especially because Victor French and Kine Holiday had real screen presence. But the writing could be blunt, and the humor often felt like it was reaching for relevance without knowing what to do with it. Still, Carter Country lasted 2 seasons. That is the strange part. It never became a major cultural force, and its second season ratings fell hard. But for a brief window, the network treated it like a show that might grow into something bigger. It never did. Number 13. Operation Petticoat, 1977. Turning a beloved movie into a television sitcom sounds easy, until you actually have to do it every week. Operation Petticoat was based on the 1959 film about a World War II submarine painted pink, and the TV version tried to stretch that colorful premise into an ongoing comedy. At first, the concept had novelty: a pink submarine, a crew of men forced to share cramped quarters with nurses, military chaos, romantic tension, slapstick possibilities everywhere. And to make the connection even more obvious, Jamie Lee Curtis appeared in the first season, while her father Tony Curtis had starred in the original film. But the movie's joke was built for a feature-length story, not a long-running series. Once the audience got past the pink submarine, the show had to survive on characters and weekly plots. That was where the engine started sputtering. The second season brought major cast changes, including Randolph Mantooth replacing John Astin as the central male lead. That kind of retooling usually tells viewers the network knows something is wrong. Instead of rescuing the show, it made Operation Petticoat feel even more disposable. Yet somehow, it lasted 2 seasons. Not because audiences were obsessed, but because networks in the 1970s sometimes gave recognizable titles more time than original ideas. In the end, this was a sitcom with a famous name, a funny submarine, and not enough fuel to stay afloat. Number 12. Project UFO, 1978. Project UFO had one of the most tempting premises of the late 1970s. It was produced by Jack Webb, the man behind Dragnet, and it promised dramatized investigations based loosely on real Air Force UFO files. In a decade obsessed with space, conspiracies, government secrecy, and close encounters-style mystery, this should have been electric. Instead, the show often felt strangely dry. That was the Jack Webb style. Procedural, stiff, controlled, almost documentary-like. For Dragnet, that approach gave police stories a sense of authority. For UFO stories, it sometimes drained the wonder right out of the sky. Each episode followed investigators looking into strange sightings, interviewing witnesses, studying evidence, and trying to separate fact from fantasy. That could have been gripping. But viewers expecting cosmic terror or wild science fiction often got paperwork with flashing lights. Still, Project UFO ran for 2 seasons. That is what makes it interesting. It was never a giant smash, and it never became the definitive UFO drama. But NBC kept it alive long enough for 26 episodes, partly because the subject matter itself was irresistible. The show is a perfect example of a 1970s survival flop, a series with a killer concept, a respected producer, and a tone that never quite matched what the audience wanted. It did not crash because the idea was bad. It faded because the execution was too earthbound. Number 11. The Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew Mysteries, 1977. The Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew Mysteries had name recognition that most shows would kill for. These characters had been beloved by young readers for decades, and the late 1970s seemed like a perfect time to turn them into glossy teen detective television. Add Sean Cassidy and Parker Stevenson, and suddenly ABC had mystery, music magazine appeal, and built-in nostalgia all at once. But the show was always a little unstable. At first, it alternated between Hardy Boys stories and Nancy Drew stories, with Pamela Sue Martin playing Nancy. That sounded fair, but the Hardy Boys quickly became the bigger attraction, especially as Cassidy's teen idol status exploded. Then came the changes. Nancy Drew's presence was reduced. Pamela Sue Martin left. The show shifted more toward the Hardy Boys. Eventually, it became less like a balanced mystery anthology and more like a vehicle, chasing whatever audience was still screaming the loudest. It lasted 3 seasons, but never fully cracked the top of television. The fan base was real, yet the constant retooling made the series feel as if the network was solving its own mystery every week. What exactly is this show supposed to be? The answer kept changing. That is why it belongs here. The Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew Mysteries was not a forgotten disaster. It was a recognizable property that survived on charm, faces, and momentum, even while the format quietly fell apart. Number 10. Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, 1979. Buck Rogers in the 25th Century looked like it had everything the post-Star Wars audience wanted. Spaceships, lasers, robots, shiny costumes, and a hero thrown into a future full of danger and temptation. The pilot even reached theaters before the weekly series began, giving it a bigger launch than most TV shows could dream of. But the problem with chasing Star Wars is that television budgets cannot always keep up with movie-sized expectations. Buck Rogers had campy fun, yes. Gil Gerard had charm. Erin Gray became unforgettable as Wilma Deering, and Twiki gave the show a robot mascot kids could quote. But beneath all the sparkle, the series was uneven. The first season leaned into adventure, humor, and space-age eye candy. Then the second season changed direction dramatically. Characters vanished. The format shifted to a space exploration mission, and the show suddenly felt like it had been rebuilt in mid-flight. That kind of change usually means panic. NBC wanted the series to last, but the audience did not fully follow the new version. Buck Rogers survived for 2 seasons, long enough to become a nostalgic favorite, but not long enough to become the blockbuster franchise TV hoped for. It was not a total failure. It was something stranger, a flashy, expensive, memorable disappointment that flew just far enough to become cult history. Number 9. Angie, 1979. Angie is one of the most dramatic examples of how fast a 1970s sitcom could go from hot to disposable. When it premiered in 1979, it had a dream lead-in, strong ratings, and a catchy theme song, Different Worlds, performed by Maureen McGovern. For a moment, it looked like ABC had found another hit. The story was simple. Angie Falco, a working-class Philadelphia waitress, marries a wealthy doctor named Brad Benson, and suddenly has to navigate class differences, snobby in-laws, and family culture shock. Donna Pescow brought charm, and Robert Hayes had the clean-cut sitcom energy networks loved. But then the network moved the pieces around. Angie lost some of its scheduling advantage, and the ratings dropped. What had looked like a rising comedy suddenly looked fragile. ABC tried to keep it alive, but the show never recovered its early heat. The weird part is that Angie still ran for 2 seasons. That sounds short, but for a show whose collapse was so sudden, it feels almost generous. It survived partly because its first season had been strong enough to make cancellation feel premature. But television can be cruel. Angie did not fail because nobody noticed it. It failed because too many people noticed it early, then disappeared just as quickly. It was a hit that turned into a flop in record time. Number 8, The Ropers, 1979. The Ropers should have been safer than it was. It spun off from Three's Company, one of the biggest sitcoms on television, and focused on Stanley and Helen Roper, the nosy landlord couple played by Norman Fell and Audra Lindley. They were familiar, funny, and already beloved in small doses. But that was the catch: small doses. On Three's Company, the Ropers worked because they bounced off Jack, Janet, Chrissy, and the constant misunderstanding machine around them. Give them their own show, and suddenly the joke had to carry more weight than it was built for. The spin-off moved Stanley and Helen into a more upscale neighborhood, surrounding them with new neighbors and fresh social climbing situations. The idea was to turn them into fish out of water, but without the original apartment chaos, the show lost the spark that made them funny. The Ropers initially benefited from its connection to Three's Company, but after ABC moved it to Saturday nights, the ratings dropped badly. Norman Fell reportedly wanted the show moved back into a better slot, but the damage had already been done. Still, the Ropers ran for 2 seasons. That survival feels almost tragic, because the spin-off not only failed to become a classic, it also blocked the Ropers from simply returning home. By the time it ended, Don Knotts had already replaced their function on Three's Company. The spin-off became a door that closed behind them. Number 7. Hello, Larry, 1979. Few sitcoms from the 1970s became shorthand for failure, quite like Hello, Larry. And that is what makes its survival so bizarre. This was not a show that quietly underperformed. This was a show people openly mocked while it was still on the air. McLean Stevenson starred as Larry Alder, a radio talk show host raising 2 teenage daughters in Portland. NBC clearly hoped Stevenson's MASH fame would carry him into another hit. Instead, audiences and critics kept comparing the show to what he had left behind. And hello, Larry suffered badly in that comparison. The sitcom quickly earned a reputation for weak writing and forced comedy. Even Johnny Carson joked about it on NBC, which must have felt like being roasted inside your own house. Normally, that kind of humiliation would kill a show fast. But NBC renewed it. The network tried crossovers with different strokes. It adjusted the cast. It pushed the father-daughter angle harder. It kept looking for a way to turn embarrassment into stability. Somehow, Hello, Larry lasted 2 seasons and 38 episodes. That is the real punchline. A show remembered as one of television's most famous flops actually had more chances than many better sitcoms ever received. It survived, because networks sometimes mistake persistence for strategy. But the audience never truly bought in, and Hello, Larry became a warning sign for every star who thought leaving a classic show guaranteed another classic. Number 6. Phyllis, 1975. Phyllis did not begin as a flop. That is the twist. When it premiered in 1975, it had a powerful advantage. Cloris Leachman was spinning off her Mary Tyler Moore Show character, Phyllis Lindstrom, and CBS placed the series in a strong lineup. The result was an instant ratings success. But television history is full of shows that launch like rockets and land like furniture. Phyllis had a problem built into its own title character. Phyllis Lindstrom was funny as a supporting role because she was self-absorbed, dramatic, and socially exhausting. In small doses, that was hilarious. As the center of an entire sitcom, she could be difficult to love. The first season rode the Mary Tyler Moore connection. But as the novelty faded, ratings began to slip. Producers tried changing the workplace, softening Phyllis, and reshaping the world around her. Then tragedy hit the cast, with key actors passing away during the show's short run, making the backstage atmosphere even heavier. Somehow, Phyllis lasted 2 seasons. But by the end, it felt like a spin-off kept alive by memory rather than momentum. Audiences liked Cloris Leachman. They respected her talent. But liking an actress is not always the same as wanting to spend every week with her character. Phyllis became a classic case of a supporting scene stealer who struggled under the weight of her own spotlight. Number 5. Rhoda, 1974. Rhoda is another show that makes the word flop complicated. In its early days, it was anything but a failure. Valerie Harper's Rhoda Morgenstern was one of the most beloved characters from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and her spin-off opened huge. Rhoda's wedding episode was a major television event. Then came the slow unraveling. The show made a bold choice by letting Rhoda marry Joe early, but domestic stability dulled the sharp single-woman energy that had made the character pop. Then the marriage started falling apart, and the sitcom had to navigate separation and divorce. Serious territory for a half-hour comedy. That risk could have made the show deeper. Instead, it made it harder to define. Was Rhoda a romantic comedy? A divorce comedy? A family sitcom? A workplace show? The answer kept shifting. Supporting characters came and went. The tone changed. The ratings softened. By the 5th season, CBS moved Rhoda to Saturday nights, where it faced tough competition and dropped badly. The show was canceled mid-season, with unaired episodes left behind. Still, Rhoda lasted 5 seasons. That is the strange power of a strong character and a powerful launch. The series survived long after its original magic faded, carried by Valerie Harper's talent and the audience's lingering affection. It began as a hit. It ended like a show the network no longer knew how to save. Number 4. The Misadventures of Sheriff Lobo, 1979. The Misadventures of Sheriff Lobo is the kind of spin-off that could only happen in the late 1970s. Take a colorful recurring character from BJ and the Bear, give him his own rural action comedy world, add goofy deputies, schemes, car chases, and southern fried chaos, and somehow, NBC had a series. Claude Akins played Sheriff Elroy P. Lobo, a lawman who was not exactly clean but not exactly villainous either. He was corrupt enough to be funny, foolish enough to be harmless, and loud enough to fill an hour. The show leaned heavily into broad comedy and action, trying to blend police stories with cartoonish misbehavior. For a while, that worked just enough, but NBC became nervous about the rural setting. In the 2nd season, the show was renamed Lobo and moved the character from small-town Georgia into an Atlanta-based crime-fighting task force. That retooling says everything. The network liked the character, but did not trust the show around him. Instead of solving the problem, the new format made the series feel even more awkward. The original rural silliness had at least given it identity. The revamped version felt like a desperate attempt to chase a different audience. It lasted 2 seasons, which is impressive for a spin-off that was basically born from a fad. But Sheriff Lobo's real legacy is not greatness. It is proof that 1970s networks would spin off almost anything if the ratings machine needed feeding. Number 3. BJ and the Bear, 1979. BJ and the Bear sounds like someone built a TV show from a truck stop bumper sticker. A handsome freelance trucker drives across America with a pet chimpanzee named Bear, runs into corrupt officials, helps beautiful strangers, and keeps rolling. That was the premise. Somehow, it became a real NBC series. To understand why it existed, you have to understand the moment. The late 1970s loved trucker culture. CB radios, convoy songs, highway movies, and outlaw road fantasies were everywhere. BJ and the Bear arrived right as that craze was starting to cool. But television still tried to squeeze a few more miles from it. Greg Evigan had charisma, the red and white truck looked great, and the chimp gave the show an instant gimmick. But the stories were often thin, the formula was repetitive, and critics were not exactly lining up to call it art. Still, the show ran for 3 seasons. That is the absurd beauty of it. It was ridiculous, but it was easy to watch. It had action, scenery, comedy, and a hero who solved local problems before moving on to the next town. Eventually, the fad faded. Ratings cooled, and even its spin-off, Sheriff Lobo, could not keep the universe alive. But for a few strange years, BJ and the Bear proved that in 1970s television, a truck, a theme song, and a chimp could carry you surprisingly far. Number 2. Donnie and Marie, 1976. Donnie and Marie was not a flop in the beginning. It was bright, polished, wholesome, and perfectly designed for families who wanted music, comedy sketches, guest stars, and zero danger. Donnie Osmond and Marie Osmond were young, clean-cut, and incredibly marketable. ABC knew exactly what it was selling. But the show also became a symbol of everything critics thought was too sweet, too packaged, and too artificial about 1970s variety television. While comedy was getting sharper and pop culture was becoming more cynical, Donnie and Marie kept smiling, through coordinated costumes and safe jokes. For a while, audiences loved it. Then the ratings began to slide. The format changed. The production moved. The variety show era itself started looking old. What once felt like sparkling family entertainment began to feel like television from a bubble the decade had already popped. Still, Donnie and Marie lasted from 1976 to 1979, producing 78 episodes. That is not a minor run. It survived because the Osmonds had a loyal fan base. The music remained appealing, and the show offered comfort during a messy decade. But as a cultural object, it became easy to mock. The comedy could look stiff. The wholesome image could feel suffocating. Donnie himself later admitted some of the comedy looked silly. Though, to be fair, that silliness is part of why people still remember it. Donnie and Marie was not a disaster. It was a glitter-covered survival act whose charm eventually became its limitation. Number 1. The Gong Show, 1976. No 1970s show captured the thin line between flop, hit, joke, and cultural infection. Quite like The Gong Show. On paper, it was barely television. Random performers came out, did strange acts, and celebrity judges either tolerated them or slammed a gong to end the madness. That was it. But Chuck Barris understood something television executives hated to admit. Bad entertainment can be addictive. The Gong Show looked cheap, chaotic, and almost proudly tasteless. Critics hated it. Serious viewers rolled their eyes. But people kept watching, because it felt dangerous, in a stupid, carnival way. This was not talent competition as inspiration. This was anti-talent as spectacle. Singers were awful. Dancers were bizarre. Novelty acts seemed invented during lunch breaks. Barris hosted like a man who knew the whole thing was ridiculous and decided to enjoy the collapse from inside the building. The show ran from 1976 into 1980, across NBC and syndication, which is wild considering how aggressively it mocked the idea of quality control. A normal flop fails because audiences reject it. The Gong Show turned rejection into the format. If an act was terrible, that was not a problem. That was the point. In hindsight, it predicted a huge piece of modern reality television. Ordinary people embarrassing themselves for attention, while viewers pretend they are above it. The Gong Show was trashy, messy, criticized, and weirdly influential. That is why it takes number 1. It was the flop that understood failure better than anyone else, and turned it into entertainment. The 1970s were a strange laboratory for television. Networks did not always know what they had, what they wanted, or when to stop. Some shows here were bad ideas. Some were good ideas handled badly, and some were simply trapped in the wrong era. But together, they prove one thing. A TV flop does not always disappear quickly. Sometimes, it gets renewed.